We have come a long way since the September 14th, 1999 hearing in this room that I chaired on human trafficking, one in the series that continues to this day. At that particular hearing, then DRL Assistant Secretary Harold Koh called human trafficking a global plague and said that while the Clinton administration supported the objective of my bill to combat human trafficking, he testified that the existing legislative framework was sufficient and that new legislation should not focus on developing new institutions or establishing onerous new requirements, quote, unquote. No tip office, no tip report, no tip sanctions, he said. Beefed up reporting in the annual country reports on human rights practices would suffice. Secretary Koh testified that the administration strongly objected to singling out and sanctioning nations with poor records and government complicity in trafficking, but did agree on the need for alien asylum protection and enhanced criminal penalties for traffickers that was also contained in my legislation. That said, I pushed ahead in a bipartisan fashion and crafted a comprehensive piece of legislation, landmark legislation, known as the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, which just celebrated its 15th day on October 28th when it was signed into law. The power of the Trafficking in Persons report, a mainstay of the legislation, rests on its credibility. And the credibility of the report rests on its accuracy. We must get the report right. No fudging, no favors to nations based on other agendas, or we risk losing the most effective tool we have to help the more than 20 million victims of trafficking enslaved around the world. Some countries, as you know, the distinguished people at our witness table, openly credit the TIP report for their increased and effective anti-trafficking response. Over the last 14 years, now into the 15th, more than 100 countries have enacted anti-trafficking laws, and many countries have taken other steps required to significantly raise their tier rankings. And of course, Tier 1 is for those who fully meet minimum standards. Tier 2 for those who are making significant efforts to meet minimum standards, and Tier 3 for those who are not making significant efforts to meet minimum standards and indeed may be subject to sanctions. And for those between Tier 2 and 3, Congress in 2003 created a Tier 2 watch list for those who have undertaken significant anti-trafficking steps late, often late in the evaluation year. And just for the record, I wrote that law too. Unfortunately, this ranking has been misused to allow countries to escape accountability, a loophole we thought we closed with the Wilberforce Act, and that bill was sponsored by Howard Berman. We are holding this hearing today to focus due to well-founded concern that some of the rankings in the most recent report are inaccurate and undermine the credibility of the report. Great inflation for certain favored countries undermines accuracy and accountability, and I would respectfully submit demoralizes countries that actually made significant progress last year. The State Department heard from many House members, 161 to be exact, when it was leaked that Malaysia was last to be upgraded from Tier 3 to the Tier 2 watch list. The report justified the upgrade because Malaysia introduced but did not pass an amendment to their trafficking law and allowed a limited number of their trafficking victims to work outside of detention while keeping the rest of the victims in detention. These incomplete actions pale in comparison to the size of Malaysia's trafficking problem. Malaysia was the subject of an incisive Reuters investigative report in 2014, and without objection, I'd like to make that report a part of the record, which found that human traffickers were keeping hundreds of Rohingya refugees from Burma captive in houses in northern Malaysia, beating them, depriving them of food, and demanding a ransom from their families. At least 2 million vulnerable migrants work in the informal economy in Malaysia. NGOs on the ground tell us that the traffickers operate openly and with impunity, and that those who get in their way are killed. Only 3 traffickers were convicted in Malaysia last year. 3 in a country of more than 30 million people. And I would just note for the record, and parenthetically here, as we went through the minimum standards over the last decade and a half, we were always trying to calibrate those minimum standards because some countries like to game the system. In the very first piece of legislation, we talked about prosecutions and arrests and found that lots of prosecutions, very few convictions. Then we started looking at how long and whether or not that individual or individuals served any time in jail, incarcerated. Again, in Malaysia, only 3 traffickers were convicted last year. If that ratio were not enough or not bad enough, it also marks the 3rd year of decline for convictions in Malaysia. 3 convictions is 1/3 the number of convictions in Malaysia that they had in 2013, when Malaysia was Tier 3, and 1/7 of the convictions in 2012. Trafficking in Malaysia is getting worse, and the government's enforcement of the law was nearly non-existent, and yet Malaysia was upgraded. So what happened? Was Malaysia's upgrade in any way related to that nation's eligibility to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership? This spring, Congress approved the Trade Priorities Act of 2015, excluding Tier 3 countries from expedited consideration by the Congress, for the simple reason that Congress did not want to increase trade with countries that engage in persistent trafficking, including labor trafficking. Malaysia was disqualified until their upgrade. More than bad optics, more than flouting the will of Congress, such circumventing of accountability is disastrous for labor trafficking victims and victims of all kinds in Malaysia. Instead of demanding change before Malaysia became a major trading partner, the administration weakened our standards to give Malaysia a pass. In other words, we looked the other way to empower a slave economy. The administration also upgraded Cuba this year to the Tier 2 watch list on very flimsy justifications, namely that Cuba began sharing information with the U.S. on trafficking and that it convicted 13 traffickers 2 years ago, which is outside of the reporting period. But what has changed in Cuba for trafficking victims in the last year? Cuba legally permits the pimping of 16-year-old girls, is the top destination in the Western Hemisphere for child sex tourism, and does not criminalize labor trafficking at all. And I want to say, again, parenthetically, I read the TIP report, all these countries. The Cuba report is excellent, but it doesn't comport with the ranking. You got it right on the report, not right on the ranking. On the labor trafficking side, Cuba does not criminalize labor trafficking. Indeed, Cuban health care personnel who are sent abroad by the Castro regime to generate income for the government report being forced to work in medical missions, having their passports withheld, and their families threatened. Again, as the author of the TPVA, I can state unequivocally that the spirit and the letter of the law makes clear that trafficking rankings should not be used in the hopes of bringing about better bilateral relations, such as Cuba. Rather, better relations with Cuba should be preconditioned on real protection for Cuba's exploited and abused children and women, and recognition of labor trafficking, which again, they just don't recognize it. The bar also seems to be lowered in this year in the case of Uzbekistan, which was upgraded to the Tier 2 watch list, despite the fact that Uzbekistan's government openly and unapologetically forces its population into forced labor every year during the cotton harvest, something Ambassador Lagon previously testified at a hearing here, having similar parallels to slavery in this country, harvesting cotton before emancipation took place in the United States. In recent years, the government has shifted away from pulling young children out of school and allowed the ILO to monitor conditions, but instead of children, they conscripted adults, continuing this systematic exploitation of its population. China's premature upgrade to Tier 2 watch list in 2014, and its continued presence there in the 2015 report, also raises very serious questions. How can a country that systematically traffics its own people be anything but Tier 3? After 1 year on the Tier 3 list in 2013, China passed a law to allegedly close its 320 re-education through labor detention centers, which forced prisoners and other detainees to perform manual labor and padded the pockets of the government. The State Department upgraded China because of that reform in 2014. But now we know from the report, and I would again put in parenthetically, I chair the China Commission. We just put out our comprehensive report on China. They just simply have changed how they do business, not the fact that the Laogai system continues and is a terrible blight on the government of China. The report itself said that the government only closed several of the 320 forced labor sites and converted other reform through labor's facilities into state-sponsored drug detention or custody and education centers. Again, a great deal of hype about this, very little when it came to actually changing the system. In other words, China continues to force detained citizens perform manual labor, and yet it got the tier upgrade it was given for allegedly ending this practice. I would note and remind my colleagues that I've chaired 55 hearings on human rights in China. Sitting right where you sat years ago was 6 members, including a Tibetan, Polden Gyatso, who talked about the so-called reform through labor camps. He held up a cattle prod and said, they put it here in our groin area, and that's how they get us when we're reluctant to perform the mission, the 12 to 14 hours a day or more that they are forced to be a part of work, so-called reform through labor. That hasn't changed. It's morphed into a different but a very similar situation. And again, that was the pretext for the upgrade. Additionally, China's coercive population control policy, in combination with a cultural preference for boys, has resulted in tens of millions of women and girls missing from the population, making China a regional magnet for sex and bride trafficking as men who reach marrying age simply cannot find a wife. Just ask the Burmese, Cambodian, Vietnamese, Laotian, and North Korean women imported to meet China's demand. And let me say, and note here as well, I wrote an op-ed that was in the Washington Times yesterday. Nicholas Eberstadt did an excellent one that was contained in the Wall Street Journal. And others have spoken out. The so-called relaxation of 1 to 2 child has not changed one iota the coercive aspects of that population control program in China, with forced abortion and forced sterilization as the mainstays, and this terrible fee that they impose, fines, draconian fines, as a means of implementation. So the continuance of missing girls will continue in China, and that will lead to more sex trafficking. We've had at this committee a number of women who have been compelled to perform sex work, in other words, sex trafficking, from other nations. An estimated 90% of North Korean women seeking asylum in China have been trafficked. We've had them sit here and tell their stories, the very few lucky ones. And of course, China breaks its word to the Refugee Convention, and rather than providing them some kind of dual remedy or protection, sends them right back to North Korea at the end of their exploitation, where then they're either executed or sent to that gulag system. Consider this. China convicted 35 traffickers last year in a country of $1.3 billion. 35, not 3,500, not 35,000, 35. Thailand, by contrast, a Tier 3 country of 67 million people, had 151 convictions in 2014. Nothing, and I say again, nothing in China's deplorable record in 2014 warrants anything but a Tier 3 ranking. Thailand, by contrast, is Tier 3. China, with such a small number, piddling number of convictions, and government complicity up and down the system, is no longer a Tier 3 country. I wrote the TVPA to allow flexibility and discernment in rewarding a country for making progress over their record from the year before, and for significant, not modest or superficial changes, efforts that go to prosecutions, prevention, and protection. You know, having a 3-day conference or making something around the edges isn't what constitutes significant. Tier rankings are a tool to aid real change, not a rubber stamp for simply holding a meeting or being a major trading partner. The rankings in this 2015 report seem to be a real opportunity lost for several countries, not just for the countries we gave a pass to, but other countries where good faith efforts were made but were not sufficiently acknowledged. No country will take U.S. trafficking rankings seriously when there seems to be a wink and a nod agreement to look the other way when it suits U.S. business or other interests. Tellingly, Reuters reports that there was a lot of infighting at the State Department between the trafficking experts at the tip office, for I have the highest regard for, and the bureaus. This year, the two sides split, according to Reuters, on 17 countries that JTIP lost almost all of those conflicts.